Hello everybody and welcome back to VUDivulged. I'm Anthony Bulkowski, the General Manager, and in today's Distinguished Speaker Series, we have Zachary Myers, who is the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Indiana. During this presentation, he talks about the steps he took in becoming a United States Attorney, and as well as some of the trends he has seen an increase in during his years. Please enjoy his presentation.
Zachary A. Myers has been serving as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Indiana since November 15, 2021. Nominated by President Biden and unanimously confirmed by the Senate, Myers leads a team of over 100 legal professionals addressing various legal matters, including federal criminal offenses, civil litigation, and the promotion of public safety and civil rights across the Southern District of Indiana.
His district includes the southern 60 counties of the state, and he has offices in Indianapolis, Evansville, and he has remote satellite offices in New Albany. Without his leadership, the districts would sorry, lost my train of thought there. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to present U.S. State Attorney Zachary Myers.
Thank you both very much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. I don't get to use my courtroom voice all that much anymore, so I'll try to speak up. And thank you again for the very kind introduction. And for those of you, who are sort of natives of West Central Indiana, we also have an unstaffed satellite office in Terre Haute, where I'll be a little bit, later this afternoon. And much of my family's from Terre Haute, so I always love to get to the western part of the state. Well, first of all, as they said, I'm the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Indiana. So every every state and all of the territories and the D.C., they all have a federal judicial district that has one or more sort of subdivisions where the federal courts are, and each federal court has its own U.S. Attorney's office that sort of serves that district. So as they said, the Southern District of Indiana is the southern 2/3 of the state. I've got a colleague in the north who has the other 32. I have been U.S. Attorney now for about 2 years. Before that, I was an assistant U.S. Attorney, sort of our line level attorneys. In my case, I was a criminal prosecutor in the Southern District of Indiana and the District of Maryland, in combined for about 10, 11 years, doing all sorts of stuff, but really focusing in technology-facilitated crimes and cybercrime and national security work. It is a unique pleasure as part of my job, now that I don't really get to do cases anymore, like some elected local prosecutors particularly are in a small enough office where they can or even really must handle some cases on their own. The U.S. Attorney's Office is a little different because we've got such a broad reach of things that we do that I don't actually handle any litigation. It's very rare for a U.S. Attorney to do so. Instead, I get to run the office. We've got more than 50 attorneys and then about 50 support staff, and we get to do just about everything that is the federal government in litigation in our federal courts. And so most of what we do, more than half of our attorneys are federal criminal prosecutors. Usually the TV shows about prosecutors are on the state side, but if you watch Billions, at least the first couple seasons is federal prosecutors, and I think there's a couple others. But we are a little different from our colleagues in the state courts. And we have an appellate division, we have a civil division that does affirmative lawsuits, like if you're violating or allegedly violating people's civil rights in terms of voting or disability access or environmental violations, or if you are suing the government, like if you get in a car wreck with a postal truck or claim you've been subject to excessive force at the federal correctional facility up in Terre Haute. We defend agencies and employees or officers of the government when they're sued in civil court, as well as bringing civil suits. But more than half of our lawyers and most of the work that we do is federal criminal prosecution. We're the local arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. As they said, I was appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate. So my boss is actually Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States. And so the 93 of us across the country are the various U.S. attorneys. We all run offices of different sizes with sort of different geographical footprints, but the same sort of core mission of the Department of Justice which has been the same for a very long time. It is, to keep the public safe, uphold the law, and promote civil rights. In fact, for those of you who, I don't know how much you guys have gotten into like the legal history of the United States, the U.S. attorneys, I think, are particularly proud of the fact that we are as old as the federal judiciary itself. The Judiciary Act of 1796 created the office of U.S. Attorney, and in fact, we had a U.S. Attorney's conference a couple weeks ago, and I had the pleasure of getting to go to the National Archives and actually see a physical copy of like the bill on like sheepskin or parchment or something that they wrote that law on that created the federal courts and the U.S. attorneys. The Department of Justice wasn't created until after the Civil War, until 1870. It used to be the U.S. attorneys were out there just on their own representing the United States. But we realized as a country that if we have now ended the scourge of slavery and are working to make that promise of equal justice under law more of a real thing, in order to do that, you're going to have to bring, whether it's civilly or criminally, you're going to have to do a lot of this work in court when you have sort of a rules-based order, under the law, and we're trying to put down our weapons at that point. But in much of the country, there was, even in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there was massive resistance to providing civil rights for everybody, and so and local prosecutors weren't. And local attorneys sort of weren't always up to the task or interested in the task of enforcing that. And so we created the Department of Justice, that a lot of our early work was fighting the first iterations of the Ku Klux Klan. And the department has grown and its mission has grown, and much of what we do now in terms of keeping the public safe, our violent crime unit focuses on gun violence, whether it is people who are using firearms in the commission of federal crimes, whether it is people who are illegally distributing firearms, gun traffickers, people who are putting guns in the hands of people who under the law have no business having them, as well as people who, the data shows us are particularly dangerous and nevertheless persist in illegally arming themselves. So our violent crime unit, really, it's the job is to try to make the public safer by addressing violent crime and putting violent criminals away. And then on the drug trafficking side, also we're focusing on saving lives. And I think everyone knows that the vast majority of the overdose crisis that we continue to face is fueled by synthetic opioids, primarily, fentanyl and related substances. But significant, about 30%, I think, in the last year of overdoses were still the psychostimulants, still methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is very much still a deadly and dangerous drug, but the opioids have really swamped that and created a overdose crisis that we've just never seen in law enforcement before when you have a drug that's so cheap, so plentiful. There hasn't been before a drug where one pill that people will make, whether it's fake Adderall, fake OxyContin, and really it's just a bunch of junk, frequently either bought off the internet or put together in a super lab in Mexico with fentanyl in it. And 2 milligrams, enough fentanyl on the tip of a pencil, can be fatal depending on your body size, metabolism, and prior usage. And right now, more than, I think the last DEA count was more than 70% now of the pills that they're seizing in the course of investigations and testing have that potentially lethal dose. Obviously, not everyone who takes one dies immediately, but you're really playing Russian roulette every time you take any pill that is not prescribed to you by your doctor or provided to you through a pharmacy. I will tell you, unfortunately, I have to say this to college-age audiences more and more now. A lot of campuses, and I haven't looked to see if Vincennes is one of them, but a lot of campuses have actually had overdoses on campus, affecting not just the friends and family of the students, but actually, students who thought, I think it was Ohio State where some students thought they were taking Ritalin or Adderall, in the course of finals, and in fact, it was fake pills laced with fentanyl, and several of them overdosed, and a couple of them died. Not as though they even intended to take that drug. So it's a danger that is just different from the prior iterations of trying to deal with drug trafficking. And so federally, we're really focusing on the distribution of those drugs because, yes, it's a local state crime, but you can't expect the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office to be identifying and prosecuting cartel bosses in Mexico that are helping manage the pills coming in from these super labs, whereas our prosecutors actually in Evansville have multiple cartel bosses, in Mexico who we have under indictment or working to get under arrest, and a couple that we have actually successfully gotten in the United States. The point being, so if I cover 60 counties with about 35 criminal prosecutors, there are 60 elected prosecutors in our district. And so even as you hear about the in-depth resources that the federal government has to reach across jurisdictions, across the country, across into other countries to do investigations, to do prosecutions, we have a depth that we can bring to individual cases, but the volumes of cases we bring are always just going to be a fraction of what happens in the rest of the legal system. Just like civil lawsuits, and the vast majority of criminal cases are always going to be in your state courts. So our local prosecutors are vital partners in everything we do, because they're going to get the most of the bad guys in every sort of area that we prosecute. And so what we're doing as federal prosecutors is figuring out what are the cases that only we can do, and what are the cases where the tools that we have are just superior to what's available in the state court. Not that the state court is bad, it's just a different system designed differently. And there's certain types of crimes that we're, if someone robs 5 banks in 5 counties with, 2 other people, in state court, each of those robberies and each of those people is an individual trial. And federally, that's one trial with everybody sitting there doing all of it together. And so there's procedural advantages. Frequently you'll hear federal criminal sentences are often significantly more serious and more lengthy than state sentences. You're not going to the Indiana DOC, you're not going to Plainfield or Michigan City or anything like that. There is the federal prison in Terre Haute, but just because you're from here doesn't mean at all. In fact, most of our defendants don't go to Terre Haute. You go to federal prison, in Kansas, in New Jersey, in Florida, in Illinois, all over the country, just depending on the risk that you pose, your criminal history, what programs the court or the prisons want to make sure you have access to. And also, pretrial detention is a reason sometimes where a federal charge might be the appropriate immediate step, where under the state constitution and state laws, if you get arrested other than for murder and treason, under Indiana's constitution, you're entitled to bail. And it can't just be, okay, you get a $1 billion bail. You're entitled to some level of bail, and there's all sorts of court cases about sort of what that can be. That's not how detention or non-detention works in federal court. It's not about how much money someone has when they're accused of a crime. That doesn't even really play into it. The questions that the court asks are, if the government is seeking someone to be detained, and we think about the same things the court does this defendant pose a danger to the community? Is this a defendant a risk of flight or a risk of obstruction of justice? If they are detained in custody pending trial. If they're not, if there are some conditions that the court can impose to mitigate against any of the risks or concerns they have based on the defendant, then they're released and put on conditions, because you're accused of a crime. You haven't been convicted. We're not sending you to pretrial detention to punish you. It's a protective thing, and so we want to be careful that we're only using it where it's appropriate. But a lot of the factors that get you held pretrial line up with the things that make us choose you as a federal defendant to begin with. Because the core of being a prosecutor is discretion. It's making choices. If there are because our office is so much smaller, there are always going to be far more crimes that could be prosecuted that meet the elements of a criminal offense that are a crime than we're ever going to be able to actually bring, even if you quadruple the size of my office. So then the business that we're in is figuring out, what are our strategic priorities? How do we use the resources that the public has given us to have the greatest impact on safety and upholding the law in the communities that we serve? And so we try to build our programs and build our strategic plan and our prosecution guidelines to address those things. But in addition to, I talked about the drug trafficking and the violent crime, then we have our general crimes unit, which is sort of everything else. It's much of, in fact, I came up in our general crimes unit as a baby prosecutor, where all of the fraud, economic crime cases, all the cyber crime, national security is its own separate, smaller unit, which we do some very interesting and fun stuff there that, maybe someday you guys will get clearance and a need to know and I'll tell you about it. But otherwise, the national security is often their own world sometimes. But also they deal with like domestic violent extremists where usually there's not classified material there. But we do complex fraud cases. We do public officer corruption cases. We do civil rights cases, unfortunately sometimes against law enforcement officers. People have been entrusted with the public's authority and nevertheless abuse that and willfully violate people's constitutional rights, usually through the use of excessive force or sometimes getting caught lying, trying to cover that up. And while those things are fairly rare, thankfully, in the scope of how many cases we bring, it's a part of the work we bring that's a priority of ours and is particularly important because to maintain the legitimacy and I think respect and support for law enforcement when people cross that line and go far beyond, not just like bad policing or bad judgments, but intentionally, committing a crime, knowing that it's a crime when they do it, then we have to hold them accountable. And we do a lot of work in the area of child exploitation. Our office is known for being particularly, successful and aggressive in that area. People who are either trafficking in child sex abuse material, particularly if they've got prior offenses in that area, or people who are actually either in person or online exploiting the children or engaging in sex trafficking, human trafficking offenses. We prosecute those as well, including actually, around here, we're up in Terre Haute, we've got some of that going right now. So we do a wide variety of work. A lot of it I think is really interesting and challenging, and I think it's important. And I hope that I know that the students in this class, in this program, and having a professor who has a lengthy history of not just public service, but public service in the federal government, federal law enforcement. I think it's important that as, I think many of you are probably considering careers in public service, that you consider not just public service, but federal public service. We need the help. Law enforcement needs help right now. We just do not have enough people putting their hands up, choosing to join law enforcement. Sometimes it is, I think, because of the pay, sometimes it's because of the risks that you face. Sometimes it's because of either the public perception or disagreement with some of the things you feel like law enforcement's engaging in. And what I try to encourage, particularly folks at the outset or the cusp of their careers, to think about is if you disagree with some of the things that you see happening in the criminal justice system and law enforcement, and I certainly know that I do. At times those things definitely come up. But if you look around, the people who are engaging in policy conversation or even, policy makers, people who are, defending individuals who've been accused of crimes, people who are, demonstrating against what they view as, abusive practices. None of them has the influence over what law enforcement does and does not do more than the people who are in law enforcement. So we want people who are thinking critically about who we are, what we do, how we serve the public in a way, because it's not, our authority. It's the public's authority that has been entrusted to us in order to do things that the public, feels and is expressed through its government are important for, respect of the law, being able to live together under a rule of law. And so I really, encourage people, to think about that the prosecutors and law enforcement officers are the ones who are making and executing the choices as to how we utilize these authorities that the public's given us. And so having people who are thoughtful, who are committed, having them in those roles and helping to make those choices, that's how you're going to, I think, most effectively make changes in some of the things that are really, upsetting, or some things that are just unjust sometimes. But also, it helps you, I think, when you're in law enforcement, realize what a difficult profession it is. And at a time when, we should, we're the government, we're entrusted with public power, we should be under scrutiny. Like, that's appropriate. But at a time when those pressures are so high, being able to bring in more people gets more difficult, and we just want to make sure that the public understands that the vast majority of people who choose to go into law enforcement are choosing that, noble profession for good reasons, that they are, every day trying to do the right thing, that they usually get it right, and hopefully we take accountability and admit our mistakes when we don't, and that we should be thankful for and celebrating the sacrifice that they do make. One of the things I didn't realize when I was a line prosecutor that I've unfortunately had to see as the U.S. Attorney is how often our law enforcement officers, just day-to-day doing their jobs, are at risk of violence, or actually even the victims of violence, even as they're trying to protect others from that violence. I did not expect to be going to as many law enforcement funerals as I've had to do all over the state, and each one of them is kind of this sobering reminder of the risks that people willingly take trying to serve the community. Now, not every form of public service carries that kind of risk, but all of them are important. So for those of you who are interested in public service, however you want to do that, whether it's through law enforcement, the military, whether it's through participating in the criminal justice system as a criminal defense lawyer, where the indigent defendants have a right in our system, and we need them to have good lawyers. And having tried multiple cases against defendants who chose not to have lawyers, I guarantee you would always rather that they have a good lawyer instead of not. I was hoping not to, I can just talk about this job and public service and what I have done and what I like to do really for hours on end. But I want to make sure to give a good amount of time to address, your concerns, your questions. I'm not sure what you've covered in class thus far this semester, so I don't know what things you're particularly interested in, or just looking around, the world, or your thoughts about law enforcement, or just having a chance to ask the U.S. Attorney some questions, whether it's about that or career stuff or whatever you'd like. I will say I was asked to touch a little bit on what the Department of Justice does and what my office does as we're in a climate where we're seeing a significantly increased, obviously for geopolitical reasons, in the last month, a significant increase in hate incidents all over the world and all over this country, particularly targeted towards our friends in the Jewish and Muslim communities. And one of the things, we talk about promotion of civil rights being in our mission, and we actually have both criminal and civil attorneys dedicated to civil rights issues, whether it's bringing lawsuits or bringing prosecutions for hate crimes. And we do a lot of outreach along those lines as well. In fact, on Monday night in Indianapolis, we're meeting in conjunction with the Anti-Defamation League and Indianapolis Metro Police, and we're talking to community folks about what it is that we do in federal law enforcement to respond to hate incidents, because of course, the First Amendment, is sacrosanct in this country, and people, have an absolute right to express their feelings, their disagreements, to do so loudly, to do so sometimes, in, wildly, inflammatory, inappropriate, angry, profane ways. What they're not allowed to do, and what no one should be subjected to, is illegal threats of violence, of criminal harassment, of people actually engaging in whether it's destruction of religious property, or engaging in violence against individuals because of something like their religious background or perceived religion, or their national origin, or the color of their skin, things like that. Those aren't just state, like assault type crimes, those are federal hate crimes. And so we do work in that area. In fact, we have some of those cases pending around the country as well. In the last few years, we've seen also an uptick in hate incidents against people of Asian American or Asian backgrounds. And so we dedicated resources there as well. And I anticipate, as long as people are experiencing increased tensions around and sort of the crises that we see around some of these issues, that some people are going to choose to do things that violate the law, and we're going to have to respond federally. But as you can kind of guess, I think is how I've bounced through things a little bit. There's a wide variety of stuff that we can do federally and that we do choose to do, even though our resources are limited and our jurisdictions a little bit limited. Because if you are beat up in a bar, if you are mugged on a street corner, that's probably not a federal crime. We can only enforce the laws that Congress passes as opposed to the states, and Congress is limited to passing things that have sort of a direct federal nexus, like for whether it's because it touches on taxes or interstate commerce or federal, like bank robbery is illegal because banks are insured by the federal government, things like that. But so what it means is that not every crime is a federal crime. So if we have limited resources and limited jurisdiction, that just puts more focus on making choices about where the right place for us to intervene federally is. And I'm sure, we can always do better, but we really do work hard at trying to get that right. So with that sort of talking a little bit fast, and I have zero concept of what time we go to, so I will rely on you guys to tell me, all right, stop. Questions, please. Excellent. I'll go this way. I saw you first, I think.
What's your education like, and like others who hold similar positions?
Sure. So I went to college, got my political science degree, and then I went to grad school. You don't have to do that for that, but I went to grad school in D.C. For political management, and then I went to law school. I went to college at Stanford and then law school at Georgetown. And then right out of law school, I went to a law firm for a couple of years before joining the U.S. Attorney's Office in Indianapolis. You have to have a law degree to do what we do, but other than that, bachelor's in law degree and like anything else is just, not extra, but is not required. A lot of people who do become federal prosecutors, whether as the U.S. attorney or as an assistant U.S. attorney, a lot of folks will do federal judicial clerkships, where they'll spend a year or two working in the chambers of a federal judge, sort of helping them with their work and seeing what it's like to be in federal court. I didn't, but many of my colleagues and the folks who work with me did. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. You. So the gentleman in the plaid.
How has your offices been changing to face the opioid epidemic and the overdose crisis?
That's a really good question. When I came to the office, and this was one of the areas where I actually had to come up to speed pretty quickly. Other than like dark web drug traffickers, I mostly did like cyber stuff and fraud, and child exploitation, I never really was a drug prosecutor. And so I had to learn a lot about sort of how we work together with law enforcement and use those resources. And when I got here and I was digging into the data, one of the things that I saw, and a lot of it's actually driven in Terre Haute and West Central Indiana, but also Indianapolis, maybe approaching 90% of our drug trafficking cases, the primary substance that was being trafficked was actually methamphetamine. For many years, we had a serious methamphetamine crisis, and we still have. The meth has also increased a lot for the same reasons that fentanyl has, because both meth and fentanyl, it used to be, when I was in college, methamphetamine, you heard, well, you can't buy too much Sudafed, and people are, making it in 2-liter bottles or, in their garage. And, that hardly ever happens anymore. Both fentanyl and methamphetamine now, almost exclusively, precursor chemicals, usually from Asia, usually China or sometimes India or elsewhere in Southeast Asia, are getting shipped to cartel facilities in Mexico. For those of you who watched Breaking Bad, back then that was much more theoretical. The chemicals going to the super labs, pumping out high volumes of extremely high potency drugs, but for at least the last 5-7 years, like that's the world. That is what we're facing in law enforcement. We're facing at a tremendous scale where tons and tons and tons of these chemicals, in fact, I think the president is meeting and talking to the president of China about that. I still call him president. I forget what they call the allegedly elected person. But the leader of the People's Republic of China is meeting with the president. One of the things they're talking about is the precursor chemicals because it's such a big problem. And so we have a drug that is so relatively cheap and yet so potentially deadly. It is something that law enforcement has never really faced before. The prior iteration of the opioid crisis was driven by primarily overprescription or diversion from the lawful pharmaceutical stream of things like hydrocodone, OxyContin. And now that is not nearly the problem as it was because everyone can just get fentanyl on the street and in huge volumes. And it kills people at a rate that none of the other drugs we've dealt with in law enforcement ever have before. And so when I get here and I see how much of our cases, and there's a lagging indicators, it takes time to build cases and identify. We're not doing, like the guy who's on the corner, selling drugs. We're looking for suppliers. We're looking for major traffickers. We're looking for, people who have significant quantities of drugs, passing through their hands or, that they're holding on to. Because with those limited resources, we're trying to get the most bang for our buck and have the most impact in our cases. And also because the federal sentences in this area are pretty significant. And we want to make sure that we're using those in the right cases because not everyone needs to be in federal prison for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So we want to make sure we're picking the right people. So one of the things that I did coming in, and as part of the guidance from my bosses, but also just looking at what's happening in the district, is we've really, it's not that meth enforcement is not still important. It is, and frankly, some of these meth distribution, drug trafficking organizations have actually started doing fentanyl trafficking as well, or even moving to fentanyl because in a lot of markets there's more profit to be made in fentanyl for the drug dealers, and so we've been pushing our enforcement to a higher and higher percentage every year of our cases being primarily fentanyl, particularly focusing on armed fentanyl dealers, on fentanyl dealers that we can tie to overdose deaths. But we know that every kilo that of fentanyl that we take off the street is many, many potential. If 2 milligrams can kill you, a kilogram is, you can do the math there, like that's a huge problem. And so we're focusing on major fentanyl distributors and sort of changing and the way you investigate and way you prosecute and some of the legal stuff you have to deal with. It's just a little different in the fentanyl context than in other drugs. And so we're working to sort of retool our practices and policies and sort of strategies to address primarily the fentanyl crisis. So that's the big change that we've made.
Thank you.
Ma'am.
How do you feel you did on one of your main cases being a prosecutor?
How did I did on what cases, sorry?
Any of your cases as being a prosecutor?
I'd like to think I did well. So federally, people hear sometimes, 90+% of federal defendants who are charged plead guilty. And of those who do not plead guilty, 90+% of those are convicted at trial. And the reason for that is not because, we're so much better than prosecutors in the state system. Like, no, it's structural. It is because federal law enforcement agents, they cannot get a subpoena. They cannot get a search warrant. They cannot make an arrest, and they absolutely can't charge someone without a federal prosecutor being part of that. It's just different than local police can and have to make those immediate decisions about they've seen a crime take place and they're going to respond and they have probable cause and they're going to make an arrest. Federally, even when they see what we call an outright arrest, even where the agent sees the crime happening, if they don't already have a federal arrest warrant, they're on the phone explaining to the AUSA to get authority to make the arrest. Like, we work hand in hand on the front end with our federal investigative partners, but also we say no. We say no a lot because there's far more cases than we can ever bring. And so for every case, essentially at its core, we're asking two questions. Can we do this successfully? Is there admissible evidence that's going to prove each and every element of the charged offense beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12 randomly selected citizens in the district? And should we do this? Is bringing a charge here, bringing these particular charges, the right thing to do, the just thing to do? Is it a good use of our resources? Is it a fair thing to do looking at all the circumstances? Does it accomplish our policy and strategic goals? And so you look at every potential case through that lens of can we do it and should we do it? And we work together early on. The federal agents don't say, hey, here you go, I did an investigation, let's go, please go charge this person. Because we're working together through the course of the investigation, frequently when an agent's like, maybe we should charge this guy, a lot of times the AUSAs will say, not yet, let's get this, this, and this. Let's find out who these other people are, and let's charge them all at the same time. And so because we have that discretion about when to move forward with charges, and because we have sort of that involvement to make sure, hey, let's get this warrant so that nothing gets suppressed here. Like, there's just all these different touch points we have that lead to, the cases overwhelmingly being guilty pleas when, you provide all the discovery to the defense, and they and their counsel look at what you've done and realize that, there aren't really a lot of good options for them should they choose to go to trial. I'd like to think that the cases that I chose to bring forward, I don't want to measure success by numbers of people who went through the system and numbers of months that people were sent to jail. I'd like to think that the cases I brought where there were victims involved gave them some measure of justice and security and safety. I did a lot of cases involving the sex trafficking of minors, a lot of cases involving the exploitation sexually of minors, and those were a particular passion to me, or people, people who've been victims of, ransomware, people who stole massive quantities of classified information from the government that were exceedingly dangerous. I try to, when I look back when I used to do cases and the fun stuff, I'd like to think that the cases I brought mattered to the people around them, and hopefully not just that, the victims involved, whether it's a robbery or a trafficking, not just that the victims, felt like they got some measure of justice from that, but, you try to think about all the people whose names you will never know because they were never victimized, and that's the primary impact that you're able to have, is that, keeping the public safe by ensuring that that person who did this terrible thing and has to be held accountable, but will, for a significant period of time sometimes, or in some cases, never be able to do that again. Yes?
So you talked about some of the issues that you're focusing on right now. Are there any issues that are really a concern right now or haven't been a concern in the past that you think could be a major problem in the future?
When I started as a prosecutor in 2011, the thought that, well, we need to get really good at tracing cryptocurrency so that we can fight back against ransomware gangs. None of those words really meant anything then. So, fentanyl, like, what's that everyone's doing? People in Scott County are dying from overdoses of Opana. No one uses Opana anymore illegally, although not really much. So the threats that we're facing always change and are always going to change. I mean, one of the statutes that has come back in vogue in terms of us using it again now is the National Firearms Act. There are certain categories of guns that are illegal, and Congress back in the Tommy gun era in the 20s and 30s, when gangsters like Al Capone and John Dillinger were running around and engaging in gun battles with law enforcement or with each other with machine guns, and the Congress and the public were horrified and made it illegal in almost every case for individuals to have machine guns. And when I started as a prosecutor, I remember when one of my colleagues who handled a lot of gun prosecutions, brought a machine gun case, and it was like, wow, machine guns? No one has machine guns. Now there's Glock switches, and like everybody has machine guns. It is terrifying, and the Glock switches itself is a machine gun conversion device. Whether it's an auto sear Glock switch, there's all these devices that you can put into a rifle, a handgun, that turn them from regular semi-automatic weapons into fully automatic weapons with something that's like the size of your thumbnail, and all of a sudden this pistol is unloading 10 rounds in under 3 seconds. And then people are putting extended magazines on them. I think we seized someone who had a 9mm handgun, for those of you who know anything about firearms, 9mm handgun with a 100-round drum magazine attached. Like, in what world does that make any sense? But also was modified to fire fully automatic. And, I think sometimes you have young people, children, or just young adults who came up playing a lot of video games and think this is cool. But we have all these mass shootings. We have, anyone who has served in the military law enforcement knows that there are very few practical applications for automatic weapons, certainly not in an urban, just setting, sort of interpersonal conflict. I mean, that's suppressing fire, when you're dealing with an enemy army. It doesn't make any sense to have all of these children running around with machine guns. but yet routinely, especially in and around central Indiana and Indianapolis, but also more and more in southwest Indiana, we're finding that the guns held by criminals, not just it's already bad that you've got an illegally armed criminal, engaging in violent crime, engaging in drug trafficking, but now they're armed with machine guns. And so just the danger posed to the public by that is tremendous. And so, that is something that wasn't really a thing even, like 5 years ago. And so we're always having to adapt in law enforcement and focusing on, well, what is the biggest threat today? And I'm sure that the things we're talking about today, 5-10 years from now are, most of them are probably going to be different, or there's going to be new things that we hadn't even considered today. So, it is a kind of game of evolution, but that's why we serve, and it keeps the job interesting. We have time?
We're going to introduce our president of Citizens University,
Oh,
President
great.
Johnson.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and
Absolutely.
insight with our students, and giving them a lot of good information to be able to help them figure out their future for their careers and what paths they may take. I know you've dealt with a lot of issues that they are probably reading about in books, but you can talk about it in real terms and share that. So really thank you, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much. I'm happy for the opportunity.
Good. Thank you.
Most fun things I get to do.
Good. Well, you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
I'm speaking for Professor Caprino, but you're welcome back anytime.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And thank you for the invitation.
Okay.
All right.
And on behalf of Eta Sigma Iota and the Legal Studies program, we're going to present you with this and also our certificate. President Johnson, you can come over here too. There you are.
Excellent. Thank you very much.